Welcome back to Purpose Driven Church for Unificationists. We're on day 38, and today we're going to finish up the chapter on how Jesus attracted crowds. So today, Rick Warren is talking about how Jesus spoke with an interesting style. He talks about how, if you look at the quote from Mark 12:37, it says, "The large crowd listened to Jesus with pleasure." He says, do people delight in your messages? Some pastors actually think they have failed in their preaching if people enjoy a message. I've heard pastors proudly say, "We're not here to entertain." And he says, obviously, they're doing a good job. A Gallup poll a few years ago stated that according to the unchurched, the church is the most boring place to be. He says, to the unchurched, dull preaching is unforgivable. Truth poorly delivered is ignored. When God's word is taught in an uninteresting way, people don't just think the pastor is boring, but they also think that God and truth, I added that, truth is boring as well. So everything reflects itself. And, a lot of them don't, a lot of the unchurched or what young people or whatever you want to call these group of people, they don't feel like there's any obligation to continue to go to a church that doesn't meet their needs or is not interesting. If they go to a place, a church they, even for our like young people, church they grew up in, if they just don't find that it's appealing to them, or if they don't feel that it applies to their life, or if they have kids, the kids aren't being well taken care of, then they'll just go somewhere else. Go somewhere else and do something else. He talks about how Jesus used stories to make his talks and sermons interesting. He says Jesus was a master storyteller. He told stories all the time. He told parables. He says one of the advantages of the story is that stories stir our emotions. They impact us in ways that precepts and propositions never do. He says if you want to change lives, you must craft the message for impact, not information. Also, just in general, they help hold our attention and they help us to remember things. And people remember stories. He says sometimes it's fun, it's interesting to watch people that once you start telling a story, they start to listen, and then once the story ends, then they stop listening. That's what he says. I'm sure it's probably true. He says, second, also Jesus used very simple language, not technical or theological jargon. He says, while Jesus taught profound truth in simple ways, many pastors do the exact opposite. They teach simple truth in profound ways. They take straightforward text and make them complicated. They think they are being deep when actually they are just being muddy. He says it is more important to be clear than clever in teaching and preaching. Keep it simple. Einstein once said, you don't really understand something unless you can communicate it in a simple way. You can be brilliant, but if you can't share your thoughts in a simple way, your insights aren't worth much. He says simple does not mean, he's saying that, in Saddleback, they have one of the most highly educated communities in America. Yet, for him, he finds that the simpler that he makes his message, the more impactful it is and the more God blesses it. He says simple does not mean shallow or simplistic, it just means clear and understandable. Simple sermon outlines are always the strongest outlines. I consider it a compliment to be called a simple preacher. Simple. I'm interested in seeing lives change, not impressing people with my vocabulary. And to add on to that, if you have a group of people that doesn't have a large vocabulary, like you have a lot of foreigners, people don't speak English as a first language, then speaking in very technical terms is ridiculous, because how can you expect them to understand? Also using sayings that don't translate well between languages. Anyway, lastly, he talks about how sometimes it's very controversial, the idea of trying to attract a crowd. The people have this kind of concept that, we shouldn't be trying to attract people, we should be going to people. But he's saying that if you look at the Bible, you see both the things. He says, for example, Jesus says, come and you will see. Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He says, we do not need to choose between go and come. Both are valid forms of evangelism. Some people will be reached by attraction, while others will be reached by confrontation. A balanced, healthy church should provide opportunities and programs for both. Makes sense. And then lastly, to finish off the chapter, he talks about this concept of responding to culture. He says that one ongoing debate, I guess you could say, in the church is how do you deal with current culture? and there are oftentimes two extreme positions. One is imitation, one is isolation. Those in the imitation camp say that the church should imitate our current culture in order to minister to it. But many times these churches, they will sacrifice their message and mission in order to blend in, and they'll likely endorse current cultural values such as the worship of success and wealth, radical individualism, radical feminism, liberal sexual standards, and even homosexuality. In their attempt to be relevant, these churches oftentimes sacrifice their theology, truth, whatever their standards, in order to, and oftentimes these kind of churches will lose their core, their center. Then you have the other extreme, which is the isolation group. This group insists that we must avoid any adaptation to culture in order to preserve the purity of the church. They fail to see the distinction between the sinful values of our culture and the non-sinful customs, styles, and preferences that each generation develops. So this, refers many times to churches that really hold on to the way that things were done in the past, and sometimes use this culture not being infiltrated or invaded by the culture as an excuse to not ever change anything. So he's saying obviously there should be something in the middle. Once again, you got extreme ends, something in the middle, something balanced is probably the best. He says the strategy that Jesus used is the antidote to both extremes, and it is what he calls infiltration. He says that Jesus, he walked among people, he spoke their language, like simple language, observed their customs, sang their songs, attended their parties, and used their current events to capture attention when he taught. But he did all these things without compromising his mission. He uses the analogy of a saltwater fish that lives his entire life in the salt water, but doesn't become salty. Doesn't become saturated with salt just because he's in the salt water. But people hated Jesus because he was so heretical in some ways. He was the friends of the tax collectors and the friends of the sinners. Jesus loved those people, and he wanted to reach those people. And the people were like, how can you affiliate with those people? How can you spend time with those people? Doesn't that make you unclean or whatever? And he's saying, we still have those people in our church today. He called them the Pharisees in the church today, which are more concerned about purity than people. If your church is serious about the Great Commission, you will never have a completely pure church, pure, whatever that means, because you will always be attracting unbelievers with their questionable lifestyle to your services. And it's messy. And even after a time, they have to, it takes time to clean up actions and ways of thinking, and can take a whole lifetime. But Jesus was the most harsh with people who were strict in their rigid religious traditionalism. And he said, and Rick Warren is saying, fulfilling God's purpose must always take priority over preserving tradition. If you are serious about ministering to people the way Jesus did, don't be surprised if some of today's religious establishment accuse you of selling out to culture and breaking traditions. You will be criticized. Anyway, food for thought, very interesting. So tomorrow we'll start on the next chapter. Thanks a lot.